Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Mark Allinson. I'm one of the Pro-Vice Chancellors here at the university, and it's down to me to welcome you all tonight, and you're very welcome to be here with us at Edge Hill. Universities provide space and freedom to explore ideas, creativity and differing views, mostly through intellectual curiosity, I guess. And as part of our being University of the Year, of which we're very proud, we wanted to extend that more widely throughout the year. And our partnership with Tate Liverpool has been hugely successful in doing that. From the Leonora Carrington exhibition to those who went, was incredibly successful. Student performances in the Tate foyer, through to developing joint research ideas and projects, and much more to come. And this evening is part of a series of lectures and conversations with renowned experts. And we have tonight two authoritative voices on the infamous American artist Jackson Pollock. Art and history intertwine and help our understanding of our past and how they shape our present. And I know we're going to get a fascinating insight into the art of Jackson Pollock, but also the times he lived in the connections to Liverpool be touched upon as well, his own character, and how all of that has been represented in one of 20th century's most famous modern artists and his works. My thanks to Roger Shannon, Professor Roger Shannon, and all involved at Edge Hill in making this event possible tonight, and also to everyone at Tate Liverpool as well. I'm going to hand over to Roger to introduce our two speakers, Dr. Stephanie Straine and Catherine Marcangeli. I knew I was going to get that wrong, but did I get it right? Was it okay? Close on me. I'm going to hand over to Roger and enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Tonight's event is being organised under the auspices of ICE, which is the university's way of connecting to the region's creative industries, and ICE stands for Institute for Creative Enterprise. It's the second in our series of In Conversations. The first one, as Mark said, was about Leonora Carrington, and we were very pleased to be able to work with Tate Liverpool in bringing back Leonora Carrington to Lancashire. And it's part of a partnership that the university has created with Tate Liverpool, which is leading to lots of interesting events and opportunities for our students to be involved in what is one of the world's renowned art and cultural institutions. I'm really delighted this evening to welcome Stephanie and Catherine to Creative Edge, which is the building which encompasses the Department of Media and Computing for the university. Now, Dr. Stephanie Straine has been closely involved in the Jackson Pollock exhibition at Tate Liverpool and has curated what is a fascinating exhibition that draws attention to some of the works by Jackson Pollock that perhaps haven't been so widely reviewed or acknowledged before, hence the title of that exhibition is Blind Spots. And Stephanie's got a really fascinating career that involves curating and contributing to exhibitions, including those representing the work of Chagall, Palle Nielsen, working with the Biennial in Liverpool in 2014, the exhibition about Andy Warhol at the Tate, transmitting Andy Warhol, and most recently the Jackson Pollock exhibition, which concludes this weekend. So if you like the images which we're presenting on the screen above us, then you've got 3 or 4 days to catch up on them at Tate Liverpool. But in conversation with Stephanie, that's on my far right, will be Catherine Marcangeli, who's a Paris-based art historian and lecturer. So we're really pleased that we've got an international duo today discussing Jackson Pollock. She's a senior lecturer at Paris University, and she specialises in art since the 1960s. She's the executor of the estate of Adrian Henri and has worked closely as a curator, showcasing some of the work or a lot of the work that Adrian Henri produced and developed in Liverpool in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And we'll see also some of Adrian Henri's work on the screen today, this evening. So it's my great pleasure and delight to welcome our two distinguished curators and art historians to our university this evening. And it represents this partnership between the university and Tate Liverpool, because we have overlapping themes of widening participation in art and culture. And after what will be an engaging and insightful conversation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions of Catherine and Stephanie as we get towards the end of what will be our 1 hour with Jackson Pollock. So, Stephanie and Catherine.
Thank you very much for welcoming us in this pretty splendid hall. So yes, Stephanie and I are going to talk for about 45 minutes about the Jackson Pollock exhibition at the Tate, which again is finishing in a couple of days, so if you haven't had a chance to go and see it, do try and see it. We're going to talk about the exhibition, about the questions that it raises and its originality as well, and then we'll take it on to talk about the legacy of Jackson Pollock in various directions and also in various countries, namely in America, of course, but also Britain and France, because a whole series of generations had to define themselves, not so much in opposition to, but in relation to Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism. Now, as Roger was saying, the Jackson Pollock show is a rather wonderful show. It was certainly a wonderful show for me, because when I turned up at the Tate, I just thought, okay, another Pollock show. It's nice to go and see Pollocks, and we know what we're expecting to find. We're expecting to find references to the Irascibles, that group of artists who in the late 40s and 50s drank at the Cedar Tavern, argued about what art should be and should be about, painted, revolutionized painting, got rid of the easel for some of them and started painting very large formats and all over painting. So we feel that we know that group of abstract expressionist artists, or the New York School as they were called also, and they were deemed responsible for shifting the center of gravity of the art world from Paris over to New York. And yet, well, that's the group, and the most exciting, usually the most sexy, really, the most famous artist in that group is Jackson Pollock. Sexy because, well, live young, no, what is it, live fast, die young? He did all the right career moves. Jackson Pollock was the most volcanic. I mean, that's usually why he's admired and revered almost. He was the most volcanic talent, improvisational talent, which really was crucial at a time when the paradigms of art and what art should be, could be, were being redefined. And so, because you feel you know Jackson Pollock when you turn up at the Tate, it's a much more exciting surprise to see the kinds of works that, of course, you know, but also, and these are some of the examples, as you enter the Tate exhibition on the right and left, you see paintings which really give a context as to who the famous Pollock is. But then you get confronted by a body of work which is these black paintings, as you were saying, the blind spot in Pollock's career. And that was the wonderful thing about seeing this show, was that it was a surprise. I mean, this is a kind of show that comes as a surprise. I just want to congratulate you on pulling that off. And I really wanted you to talk about, maybe to start with, to talk about the layout of the show and also the rationale that went with it.
Definitely. It really exactly was as you described, in that we didn't want to simply present our audiences with the known version of Jackson Pollock. So what essentially constitutes 4 years of his practice, which is to say the all over dripped abstract works from 1947 to 50, which cemented his reputation but also made him a figurehead of abstract expressionism and made him this poster boy for the movement and also for American cultural dominance in the post-war era. We wanted to examine the huge amount of work within his practice that isn't really considered when you take that small sliver of work, which undoubtedly changed the direction of painting and changed the direction of American art, but nonetheless, due to its incredible iconicity and legibility, has somewhat obscured other facets of his body of work, namely these pure black enamel paintings that he produced in 1951, so some of them here, and also his works on paper, his printmaking and his sculpture. And that really came about because my colleague Gavin Delahunty and myself, he was our head of exhibitions at Tate and is now senior curator at Dallas Museum of Art, where the show will travel next. We realised that these black paintings hadn't been exhibited in any great number since a very small show at the ICA in Boston, Massachusetts in 1980, so 35 years ago. And that actually only included 12 of these paintings from 1951. But it really put forward a very strong argument to their importance within Pollock's body of work, and specifically their return to figuration and representation. So this automatic assumption we have that Pollock essentially stands for pure abstraction is completely undermined by these works that don't come before the pure abstraction, but actually there's something he returns to after the mural-sized, incredibly vivid, all-over skeins of multicolored drips and lines. And so we were interested in that question of what does it mean for an artist to return to an earlier language. So Pollock was obviously, dealing with representation in the 30s and 40s when he was engaged with Thomas Hart Benton and the Works Progress Administration, but also he was engaged with Surrealism. So what does it mean to return to something 20 years later and to produce a new body of work with these very different reference points?
But what I thought was particularly interesting, and we've got here a slide that shows the Turkey Baster that Pollock uses, is that this was a show that really stressed the process and the making of those pictures, and partly because there's a selection of works that are on various supports. There's some board, unprimed canvas. Unprimed is quite important because it soaks up paint in a different way, or a selection of very exquisite papers that also interact with the paint. And it's a show that really tries to stop us from looking at an image and engage us to look into the process of creating that image, not so much in terms of the choreography of Pollock dancing around the canvas and the canvas being the remnant of a performance and the trace of a performance rather than a finished product, but really a much closer look at the artist and here the paper and the interaction between the two, where chance and the way that materials interact is really focused on in the show, and I thought that was one of the important.
Yeah, and I think that that's partly a reaction against what people understand to be Pollock's work, which is actually quite a lot of the time taken from the Hans Nemeth photographs. So those images we had earlier of him sort of dancing, as you say, around the canvas, and that kind of very performative aspect of his body in relation to the paint surface, that doesn't actually stress the finished product, because we don't have an understanding of what the finished work is. We have it in process, and what the show does is really kind of emphasize that these are finished pictures and that they're very much, as you say, about the material-led process. So what changes, and you can see here, is that there's a huge amount of the raw unprimed canvas left exposed as part of the finished painting. So they're not black and white paintings, they are black on raw canvas, and that's the very kind of warm buff tone that you see. And yes, we've got the figuration, we've got these kind of bodies or human faces or parts of bodies emerging, but that really comes from the materiality of the work. And what's crucial, as Catherine says, is that the canvas isn't primed, which sounds like a sort of minor technical point, but actually it means that the enamel he's using soaks into the canvas in a really unfettered way. And that has caused conservators massive problems now, decades down the line, because he's using an industrial enamel paint, which was, you know, to put on your gutters.
Like corrosive,
it was corrosive, exactly. So he was using something that was designed for outdoor, hard, industrial use, and quite illogically using it in the realm of a fine art canvas painting. And the very corrosiveness of the enamel means that the paint is in the process of attacking the support that it's on, and that is more true now, 60 years down the line, than it was then. But I think you get that sense of his willful experimentation of new materials and new paints. So when he began to use industrial enamel paints in the mid to late 40s, they were quite new consumer products, and he jumped in there to sort of move away from the kind of traditional idea of an artist using oil or acrylic. And
Picasso was doing the same thing around about the same time in the Second World War. When he was in Antibes, he was just going to fishermen to take the paint with which they painted their boats, and he was just taking actually pictures from the museum vaults and old 19th century pictures, and just, you know, using them as bare canvas and putting these little pictures on it. And there is, I mean, there's that experimental glee at looking at it and thinking, okay, what's this going to do for me?
Yeah,
because there's a surprise for the artist as well. Yeah.
Because you can see the difference, you know, compared to, say, Summertime, or the works that have this very kind of hard-edged graphic quality of the drip, and the idea of sort of layers of these different coloured lines building up and building up. You've got something that's much more about the relationship between the canvas and a single colour. Yes, there were some that make use of a kind of touch of rust or red, some have a kind of accent of an aluminium and silver paint, but on the whole it's about this relationship between the blackness and the canvas. And the way it soaks into the canvas, you can really kind of get the sense that it's almost kind of staining or soaking, that seems to kind of change the language, the formal language, from the drip or the kind of flung gesture, and it becomes about a form of kind of drawing, really. And Pollock's widow, Lee Krasner, when she was speaking about this body of work in 1969, she described them as drawings rather than paintings. And similarly, Pollock, when he was in the process of making the series in 51, when he was writing to a friend, he said, I've had a series of drawing in black on canvas. Think the non-objectivists will find them disturbing, i.e. those people who were holding him up as a beacon of abstraction. And he said, and the kids who think it's easy to splash out a Pollock. So he's talking about himself in the third person, and he's really aware of the kind of reputation that the last 4 years of practice.
But also he's thinking about the very nature of drawing, because as you point out in your essay, I think, drawing usually is line. And here it's a drawing that is processed, that is traced, that is soaking and staining and behaving, happening. And in fact, one of the critics was saying about there's something happening here.
Exactly.
That there's this feeling that he's really experimenting not just with the material, but with the very process that he would have by then been used to anyway. So it's about time to try something different. It's also a process that he's inherited from the surrealists, amongst others. I mean, the way that Max Ernst would do all these frottages, when he would take a sheet of paper and put it on a wooden floor and rub it with graphite and then just see what happens. Except I think there's probably a difference between that process, which is you leave it up to chance and then you interfere with it. I think with Pollock, he's actually working with chance at the same time. It's not two successive processes.
Yeah, I think it's more simultaneous rather than we'll do one outcome and then we'll work with that. Because, as you said, he made use of a basting syringe or a turkey baster in order to apply this black paint to the canvas. So he was still occasionally flinging the paint direct from the can or using just a hardened paintbrush or a stick, but he began to buy these basting syringes by the dozen, so that once he had thinned down the enamel paint so it was more liquid consistency, he would then just take it into the syringe and then apply it in a squirting action. So he was still working with the canvas on the floor of the studio, as had been the kind of critical move in the all-over drip paintings, but he was kind of giving himself another tool or intermediary, and it definitely seems like he was on this tightrope between, as you say, chance on the one hand and a kind of extreme level of control, because, you know, if he didn't have an absolute mastery of this media, it would have been just a complete mess, a complete splodge. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have both a small selection of the work that precedes the black paintings before them themselves, because really until you see them in person you can't quite conceive of how different the process is in a painting. Like, you have to see the actual works, because so much of our experience of Pollock is either, you know, the sort of overly dramatic black and white, you know, sort of photographs of this sort of like icon of, you know, masculinity and the kind of heroic ab-ex gesture, or you're seeing his work as a JPEG or a reproduction in a book, and it doesn't really give you that sense of what's different about the surface and what he's changed.
I think that's something that really comes through in the series of drawings that are exhibited towards the end of the exhibition. I'm just going to speed through to them, but the end bit would come back to the idea of figuration. But I was just, while we're talking about process, I think that this room was really, for me, the little jewel in the exhibition, because it really showed the process for Pollock and that tightrope between chance and control. Did you want to explain how they were made?
Well, the drawings, they do seem really important, particularly for the black paintings, because they seem to have been made before the paintings, which were definitely in the summer of '51. And the first important thing to note is that they're a product of him leaving the studio for a period of months. So he had his very kind of monumental Betty Parsons show at the end of 1950, which is where he showed works like Lavender, Mist and Autumn Rhythm. So those canvases that are, you know, about 5 meters wide, and they come to kind of stand in for our reading of Pollock now. What people forget about those paintings, because they are now kind of firmly lodged as the most important paintings of the American post-war, is that he only sold one at that show to a friend at half price. And he was utterly dismayed by this, you know. He, at the same time as he was being held up as the greatest living painter in the United States, was not selling work from his gallery shows and wasn't actually making enough money to really live on. And so that kind of discrepancy between his public visibility and persona and his success in financial terms was incredibly disturbing for him, and, you know, rightfully so. And so Pollock and Lee Krasner spent the winter of 50 into 51 in Manhattan at their friend's apartment, the same friend that bought the painting, so he's clearly a very good friend. And so he didn't have the studio, he couldn't paint on canvas, he couldn't do any of these larger scale works, and he decided to make a series of works on paper instead, and that's what we have in this room here. And they were a result of another gift, or a kind of act of generosity on behalf of another friend, which was the sculptor Tony Smith, very, very famous artist in his own right. He gave Pollock a pack of newly available Japanese mulberry paper. So remember, this is only 6 years after the end of the Second World War, so, you know, it's just being exported again back into the United States would have been quite a fresh, different material to work with. And he sets off producing this series of drawings, which I think are responsible for changing that technique within the paintings, because they rely on the very particular materiality of the mulberry paper, which is to say very, very sort of almost translucent paper surface. You know, if you sort of know what that kind of Japanese paper looks like, it allows paint, or in this case ink or watercolour, to soak through multiple sheets if you let it, and that's what Pollock did. He didn't even unwrap it from the packaging, and he would make his drawing on the top sheet, and the marks would transmit to the lower sheets just by process of their
you
transparency.
see that on the left.
Yeah.
It's actually the same picture, but at the top there are more marks, and at the bottom are the marks that soaked through. So he's controlling and not controlling.
Yeah, and so we wanted to kind of include that stack so you could kind of match up the marks as they move through subsequent layers of the block of paper. And what was interesting particularly about these works is they must have only been made between, say, January and March in 51, and then he goes back to the Springs in East Hampton, which is where they had relocated in 1945, and back to the studio, and begins working with the enamel on canvas. And when you look at the works on paper, you see the sort of capillary action of the way the ink soaks into these fibres, which is then completely replicated in the way the thinned enamel soaks into the unprimed canvas. So there's a kind of process jump between two mediums. And what's interesting is that the drawing is what becomes the catalyst for the painting. And it's not in a way that sometimes drawing is positioned, which is as a preparatory study or a sketch for a painting. These are wholly distinct and wholly kind of separate works and drawings that don't have a kind of subsidiary role to the paintings, but actually they're almost ahead of them in terms of the experimentation and of the change of direction in his practice. And you see with works like this one, they're all basically untitled. He, really either at this point in his career is either just giving numbers to works or untitled. Because he doesn't want to kind of give you associations ahead of time. It's really supposed to just be the information within the work. And so you can also see kind of creeping in influences of the natural world and the kind of very clearly sort of plant-like frond structures within this work from the Manil in Houston is interesting because we know that he had a copy of On Growth and Form, the Dorothy Wentworth Thompson sort of catalogue of structures and cells and drawings of plant and animal life that was published in the very beginning of the century, but in the same year, coincidentally, it's when Richard Hamilton makes a show at the ICA in London, completely inspired by On Growth and Form. And so, again, what we're wanting to do is kind of shake off the idea that Pollock is an abstract artist, and actually he was always very insistent that he wasn't. A very famous quote of his where he says, "I'm representational some of the time and a little all of the time," and he's really insistent about that. But of course the way he's narrativized by Greenberg means that kind of slips out of the discourse.
And that's really crucial because it really shows the role of the critics in creating the history of abstract expressionism. For Greenberg, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with his work, but basically Greenberg, the Pope of critics really in the 20th century, one of the most important critics. For him, Pollock really represented, because he was so abstract, he really represented the artist, the painter by excellence, because he, according to Greenberg, Pollock was reaching for what was specific, what was essential in painting. Basically, a painter is supposed to, his own job, a painter is supposed to try and find out what it is that makes him specific as a painter. So it's not telling story, because for that we have novels. It's not showing reality, because for that we've got photography. The specificity of painting is paint, is the arrangement of colors on the flat surface. And so for Greenberg, somebody like Pollock, who looks like that's exactly what he's doing, arranging shapes and colors on a flat surface, for Greenberg, Pollock is the exceptional painter who is almost like the end of history. He is the painter by excellence. And so, of course, he would feel a little bit betrayed when Pollock says things like, "I am representational all of the time." And because for him, it's like, no, this is not the history I want to tell. This is not the canon I want to establish. And it's quite crucial, really, to think of the role of critics in establishing movements. I mean, even Harold Rosenberg gave the title action painter. So those critics actually create the concept and the school of paintings. And certainly in terms of Pollock, I think that one of the things the show does is to show also the tension between abstraction and figuration in the work of Pollock. Here we've got a, even though it's just numbered, there's no title, but you're looking for a human face, or you're looking for a shape that you recognize. And that's something that a lot of the abstract expressionists were very keen on. Motherwell was figurative some of the time. De Kooning said that the human body was perfect, for oil paint was invented to depict the human body. So in spite of all these critics who repeatedly hailed abstract expressionist painters as these amazing artists who were abstraction, who were the truly American response to the awful, evil socialist realism of the Soviet Union at the time, that was a very crucial role, but that wasn't claimed by the artists. It was very much claimed by the critics.
And what's interesting about Greenberg is that he did actually befriend Pollock. So he began writing about him in the 40s, and by the early 50s they were definitely friends. And we know that because one of the drawings we have in the show on the left was a gift for his birthday in January 1951, and it's written, inscribed on the bottom for Clem, January 16th, Jackson Pollock. So you wonder what he made of it, because exactly that, these are the uncomfortable remnants or ruptures that don't fit his narrative of Pollock. And we know certainly the black enamel paintings, when he's kind of redefining and rethinking his sort of doctrine of abstract expressionism in the 60s, because he continues to write about Pollock long after his death, and his sort of big manifesto modernist painting wasn't actually published until 65. So he's continually reworking that idea of the canon, but there's certainly no place for the black enamel paintings within that story. And for Greenberg, in that narrative, Pollock's career stops at 1950 and stops at the pure skeins of graphic abstraction, and there's no place for the kind of messy truth that actually that was not the end point. The end point was far more complicated, and it involved a kind of very complex intertwining of abstraction with representation together. And I think it's really taken a number of decades for people to feel comfortable to start talking about that and to start rewriting what has become the kind of very orthodoxy of the New York school.
Yeah, and it's, well, I mean, that picture there on the right is one of the important pictures in that respect. And in about 53, he comes back to colour. He has these...
So 51, he's kind of almost exclusively working with the black enamel. And what we wanted to kind of argue is that the kind of group as a whole finishes with this work on the right, which is Portrait in a Dream, which is painted in 53. And it's around 52 and 53 that he reintroduces colour back into the palette, but in a way that is nothing like how it's operating previous to 51. And what you have with Portrait in a Dream is essentially two paintings within one piece of canvas. And really, we are arguing that this is the last painting that fits within the idea of the black paintings or the black pourings because of what's going on the left-hand side, which is the dream of the Portrait in a Dream. And the right is what has been recorded by Pollock himself as saying that it's a self-portrait while he's under the influence of alcohol. So this is the other kind of thing that I think has been a bit of a blockage in terms of the reception of these paintings, is that it's well documented that at the end of 1950 he ended a period of sobriety, and we know that he struggled with alcoholism throughout his life. But that the period in which he produces his most well-known work does coincide with a period of sustained sobriety, and perhaps people have been very quick to dismiss the dark, malevolent imagery in the black paintings as being just an immediate kind of direct link to his own personal state of affairs. And I think
because black is, I mean, it's such an obvious
it's too
association.
easy. It's too easy to say that.
And it's when I entered the exhibition, I was reminded, just because of this blackness, the black color, I was reminded of an exhibition which took place in Paris in 46, at the Mag Gallery, which was called Black is a Color. And I was struck by the difference really between those two exhibitions, because the 1946 exhibition was Black is a Color is a quote from Matisse, who's basically saying, you know, black has got all this richness about it. It's not just the background or something that you use for highlights or against which you use highlights. And so it was a whole show of black paintings by Braque, Bram van Velde, Matisse, Picasso, etc., etc. And in that show, black was very much explored as a rich texture that could be used to play with the, you know, the push-pull, the idea of volume suggested by blackness. Whereas here, black means or works quite differently, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's so many ways that you can read the colour, and yeah, I definitely agree that it is treated by Pollock as a colour, and certainly it has the kind of density and richness of a hue for him in these works. We can read them through Goya's late paintings. We know he was looking at those at this particular moment. We can read them via a dialogue with Picasso, particularly Guernica. We know, for instance, in the late 30s, when Guernica travelled to New York on its kind of initial tour, Pollock visited the work. I think it was within a wider Picasso show at MoMA. And he studied and sketched from Guernica, and particularly number 14 in our exhibition, there's a very kind of almost direct quote from Guernica, the woman who's leaning back and screaming with her mouth open in the top right of Guernica. It's sort of quoted almost directly by Pollock within number 14, and I think there's something inevitably about the kind of traumatic associations with black that you don't simply need to tie to his own personal biography. You can read it in a kind of wider socio-political sense of trauma, and of kind of
the Cold War.
The Cold War, exactly, and the kind of grappling with that on a sort of pictorial level. And I think the return of the figures within these works it's certainly not as simple as saying, well, he was struggling with his own personal demons, therefore these are dark, disturbing paintings. I think it's much more about a kind of awareness of what is required as a painter and what's required as a visual language, and also the sense that perhaps he had reached a sort of dead end with his work, and that you couldn't possibly keep making those incredible all-over dripped works.
One of the critics used to say those the big classic Pollocks were like apocalyptic wallpaper.
Yeah.
And there comes a point where that's it, you know, once a newspaper calls you Jack the Dripper, you've become a phenomenon. And it was something so obvious about the large paintings, which you just thought, okay, are you going to carry on making the same picture? I mean, it didn't stop wanting. But in his case, I think the colour black and the process was a way of trying to look for the next thing.
Yeah, to look for a way to continue. And I think, you know, you cannot bundle these works within the works from 53 to 56, which is to say the paintings within the last couple of years of his life, which we don't include any of those because they really are the product of somebody who is unable to work at the level he was before. And I think we need to kind of release these works from the burden of, you know,
exemplarity.
Yeah, his kind of ill health, and to say, well, actually, this was somebody still very much in control of his medium, and he knew what he was doing when he embarked upon this work as a kind of conceptual series. And we know that he treated them as a conceptual whole because of the way he displayed them and kind of thought about them within the studio. So once he had painted them, he would pin them up on the wall, and you'll note that sometimes he doesn't cut them down into individual panels until later, so he's kind of looking at them almost as a cinematic sequence and a movement in time. And I think that's another thing that distinguishes these from the earlier works, and that they're kind of being constantly thought and rethought again.
And here we've got a whole selection of paintings, more or less figurative. And I think that that tension between the abstract and the figurative is something that the next generation, in fact, painters exactly almost contemporary and just a bit younger, were grappling with. And here you've got a painting by Larry Rivers called Washington Crossing the Delaware, it's 1953. And here Larry Rivers, who was exhibited consistently with the abstract expressionists at the Museum of Modern Art in 1953, is already trying to bring in elements from figurative elements, not only from landscapes or whatever, but from kitsch representations. This is Washington Crossing the Delaware. Every classroom in America had one of those pictures in the 50s. And so it was a historical painting. It's inspired by a German painter, German-American painter called Leutz, who did his own version, much more heroic version of Washington Crossing the Delaware. Here we've got this feeling that Washington's on the edge of falling into a grave. That's partly because this is inspired by the Courbet painting, you know, the burial at Ornans. But what interests me here is that Larry Rivers is using the same vocabulary. He's using oil and a cloth with turpentine, and he's, what do you call that? It's like wishy-washing the paint into the canvas. So here we have traces of a process, and at the same time we have an image that is so incredibly recognizable by every single American. It really shocked Clement Greenberg, for example, who said, well, up until now I thought Larry Rivers was all right, but now I think you can say, I think he stinks. And that's what he said about Larry Rivers. And this whole generation of artists were really grappling with the legacy of Jackson Pollock and his gesture. Here we've got Rauschenberg, Factum 1 and 2, Factum 1 on the left, Factum 2 on the right. And the way he did those paintings wasn't a way to criticize abstract expressionism. It was a way of interacting with abstract expressionism and asking questions. Abstract expressionism, certainly the Pollock kind, was supposed to be spontaneous. I was talking about volcanic energy. And so the assumption was that this painting could only happen once because it was the product of an interaction in one moment. And so Rauschenberg went and did his own little collage on the left with abstract expressionist drips and bits of a calendar, bits of newspaper, bits of photographs, and then he did it again. They're very rarely exhibited together, those two, but when they are together, they really ask the questions, what is it to be spontaneous? What is the abstract expressionist sacrosanct gesture? And that's the kind of question that runs throughout this dialogue between the neo-Dadas, Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns and others, and the previous mammoth generation. I mean, really, Pollock was a mammoth. He was like a semi-god in terms of what he brought to the definition of what painters should do. Painters weren't supposed to use reality. They certainly weren't supposed to depict reality. And suddenly, you got people like Rauschenberg who used newspaper clippings. Another element of this dialogue between Rauschenberg and the abstract expressionists is this drawing. It's curious to call it a drawing because it's an erased drawing. It's a drawing by de Kooning, the abstract expressionist painter, and Rauschenberg went and borrowed it off de Kooning. He explained to de Kooning that his aim or his intention was to erase it. And so it's this curious action of erasing a drawing at the time when you're making it. And Pollock at times does that. You don't know where the drawing is and where the disappearance is. And this notion of the brushstrokes, the sacred brushstroke, is something that is going to be taken to a logical and almost absurd end by the pop artist Lichtenstein. Roy Lichtenstein used to be, before he turned pop, as it were, he was an abstract expressionist painter, and he was one of those painters who felt that there was nowhere else to go. You know, once you've had that generation, you couldn't produce another abstract painting. And here, on the left is the vignette, what do you call it? The cartoon frame, the frame from the comics that that Lichtenstein used on the right, and you see how suddenly the brush stroke, which is supposed to be a trace that forms, that forms the image, here becomes an object almost that is to be depicted. So it's not the vehicle that creates the image; it is the image that is represented. So there's a lot of irony here, you know, complete with drips on the, so that's a very much a drip painting. And it's taken to an even greater extreme. This is outside the Hirschhorn in Washington.
Yeah.
And it becomes an object. It becomes a monument. And this notion of the brushstroke as a monument is something that is going to be explored by a lot of the artists. This is, here I'm going to go very fast through the last 3 minutes worth of, is that me? Is that you?
I don't know. I'll be still.
Let's not move. This is the French Jackson Pollock, if you like, Georges Mathieu, who used to dress as an aviator and do his thing, these big abstract paintings. See now how this is action painting, it's French action painting. At the same time, for late 40s, and he lived quite old, so he did that for quite a long time. But he did them as performances in front of audiences of up to 2,000. In '56, I think he did.
Which Pollock would never do.
Which Pollock would never do. And so again, that's to show how the same kind of abstract gesture can be the product of a totally different process. Another process that also questions the drips. This is Niki de Saint-Phal. There was an exhibition at the Tate a few years ago. Niki de Saint-Phal, who's best known for her big nanas, you know, the big ladies. Here, the series that she first became known for was called Tir, shootings, where she would attach bags of paint onto a canvas or an assemblage of objects and then just shoot, and the bags would be the drips, the drip painting. So that's another version of action painting. More action painting in France. This is an anthropometry by Yves Klein, who is going to be exhibited at the Tate next year.
Next October, so yeah.
So here you have the human body, the human body as paintbrush. But again, we've got this notion of performance. And performance and happenings is something that is going to be absolutely crucial in the late 50s and the 60s with somebody like Alan Capro. Alan Capro was also an abstract expressionist painter, and in 1958 he wrote an essay titled The Legacy of Jackson Pollock. And the question he asked was, okay, Jackson Pollock's dead, he did those amazing paintings, where does that leave us? And where it left the artist was using the real, and he has a whole list, using sounds, using objects, using photographs, using debris from the street, using 42nd Street and 14th Street, using reality as the very material for artworks which were no longer paintings to be hung in museums, but performances. So it's really taking the notion of the performance to into another direction, not to negate Pollock, and he says in his 1958 essay, I'm not trying to negate painting, I'm trying to offer other alternatives for artists. And he says the young artist today must not call himself a painter or a dancer or a sculptor. You are just an artist, and the world around you is the material that you use. And so Capro, very much involved in his happenings and environments, he involved the audience, who were given tasks, write a word, play an instrument. He even had, early in his career, he had paintings that he called action collages. So it's really a reference to Pollock, direct references to Pollock, but he extends that into the world, into the environment. This is called yard, and at the back of the Martha Jackson Gallery in New York, he just piled up this environment in which the audience was no longer a passive spectator, but an active participant in this experience of space. High heels to be left outside, huh? Fluids, 1967, is another one of those processes. When we talked about Pollock, we talked a lot about process. Here it's an ephemeral process where overnight several participants built this sculpture made of ice, and then it just melted. So it's this notion that the artwork is a moment, is an ephemeral moment, and that's certainly what Jim Dine, the terms that Jim Dine used when he talked about his happenings in 1960 at the Judson Church in New York. He had this one happening called The Smiling Workman, it's 1960. And in this happening, he basically ran around a lot with flashing lights and a bit of noises, and he wrote very, very fast, "I love what I'm doing," and at the end of that he took the bucket and did a drip painting over his own head and just kind of, that's it, and then he drank from it, and then he poured it over it. So talk about being inside the paint, as Pollock said. So Jim Dine was one of those artists who said art should be a moment of intensity, not an artwork that you go and look at, that you hang and that you have conservators to restore it when it dissolves, but a thing that is designed to be dissolving. So these are just pictures of happenings by Jim Dine, and just as a conclusion, one of the artists who did happenings in Liverpool in 1962 and was very much in corresponding with the New York art scene and with Alan Capra in particular, was Adrian Henri, who did also have this tension. He was trained as a painter with Richard Hamilton in Newcastle, and he was really also in between, just like Larry Rivers, in between the legacy of the abstract gesture and the intrusion of the real world, commercial advertising, iconography in particular. So this juncture between those two images. So here you can see those drips and then real objects. And just like Capro before him, collage and assemblage turned into three-dimensional happenings. The idea was that a happening was something that you couldn't stick to canvas. So that's people, noise. This is the first happening happened in Liverpool. It was called City, urban happening, and which was a mixture. So here you have posters, blaring sounds from the city, poems. This is the young Roger McGough in the middle, and Pete Brown on the right, who wrote the lyrics for Cream, for those of you who know the band Cream. On the left, Adrian Henri. In this environment, just like in the New York happenings organized by Cage, by Rauschenberg, by Capro, several things happened at the same time. Adrian would paint live pictures while somebody read a poem, while somebody else played music, while you had the tarpaulin ceiling of the room collapsed on people, and there was a shower of the tops, bottle tops and commercial iconography. So really we're back to this notion that art is a process that happens in time. It's not theatre, and it's not part of the history of theatre. It's part of the history that Jackson Pollock started with the gesture and this importance of process. And I think maybe we'll leave it here. I'm just going to show you a few more.
And it's also interesting to point out that Adrian Henri was the author of a really important Thames and Hudson book, Environments and Happenings, which was first published, is it 73?
1974, yeah. It was called Total Art in the American edition, and it was the first survey. It was an interesting book because it tries to survey happenings and performance art as it's happening.
Yeah, it's very ambitious because he's talking a lot in the present tense because these artists are still working and making this type of environment. And within that book, he makes that lineage or link from Pollock to Caprow through this essay, which, as you say, Caprow only wrote 2 years, it was only published 2 years after Pollock's death, and he had, I think, begun writing it even before then. And that idea of a transition from a single support to a full environment obviously plays a huge part in minimal and process art in the United States, which is kind of happening alongside the performance-based work. But I think for me, it's really interesting to see how quickly it took root in the UK as well. And I think
there's a letter from Caprow to Adrian Henri that's dated mid-60s. So already at that time they were talking about their different practices. And it is, even though originally we thought, oh, how can we talk about the link with, is there a link with Liverpool, is what we were wondering. And in fact, through Caprow and through the notion of performance that he inherits directly from Jackson Pollock, there is this very, very quick 4 years, that's all it takes, for it to come from America to some provincial town of Liverpool. I'm saying that actually because it's quite important, because it happened in Liverpool before it happened in London, and I think that's quite an important link to make between something that could probably be deemed quite confidential. Alan Caprow's essay on Pollock was published in a magazine, but this magazine made its way to Liverpool, and within 2 years there was links and correspondence between the two continents. And I think that's really something that comes from, well, it's very visible in the exhibition, the notion that process, being in the picture, but also being in the process of making the picture, that's quite a central tenet really in the exhibition. I think that's one of the most exciting things for us to see. So we're going to maybe turn it over to you if we've got a couple of 5-10 minutes for questions. If you had any questions, you don't have to. But,
just to say,
yes,
up there. Yeah. Can you wait for them? Can you get the microphone, please? That's great. Thanks.
Is abstract gesture linked to the creative process?
Yeah. What you might like, I don't know what you mean by linked to the creative process, but I think that the gesture is one of the tools. Like, you have medium. It's one of the media. You have the stick or the paintbrush, you have the paint, you have the bucket, you have the canvas, and you have the hand which has to coordinate with the eye and the brain very quickly. So all of that interacts. And I think that certainly Pollock was reacting to what he was seeing. So it's very quick reaction. When you see a film, there's a film by, that you mentioned, the Namus?
Well, that's maybe just my
where you see Pollock paint, and he doesn't stop. He just goes, and then he stands back, and then he goes, and there is an immediacy in the gesture that is part of, you don't know what the image is going to be, but you react very quickly to what you've just done. I don't know if that answers that question.
Partially.
Which bit did I miss out?
Sorry.
Which bit did I miss out? What did you mean by that question?
Well, we're raised with ideas about creativity. But the abstract gesture of new modern art blows that apart, really. That's what I'm trying to say. But it's very interesting. It's certainly expanding my ideas about creativity.
But it's one way to be creative. I mean, certainly with those happenings, you've got another way of being creative. With collages, you have another way of with collage and the gesture, you've got another way of. It's all about creating images.
I think for Pollock, the gesture is about a kind of embodiment for him. So, as Catherine was saying, and as the photography of him at work really delineates, is that the gestures and the movements he makes with his body, so not just his hand, but his shoulder, his elbows, his wrist, the whole body is involved in that process of getting these marks on the canvas. That seems to be the creative act for him, and whether or not a figure emerges or something that we could recognise, perhaps the most important part is this idea of linking it to the artist's body, and that seems to be what people like Capra picked up on, and the idea of being able to embody creativity without necessarily having a product that represents the real world. But I think it's always tricky because in a way all these sort of notions of gesture and creativity are slightly beyond the grasp of language. You know, we can only go so far in kind of articulating that because it's slightly beyond language, and that's what's so sort of ineffable about it. That's a massive cop-out, but...
Question here.
Just picking up on that, what is the difference between being creative and being an artist?
Huh. Okay.
These are hard questions.
Artists are not necessarily creative, actually, and vice versa. I don't know is the answer. But,
She's flipping into French. This is a bad sign. What did I say?
So, I don't know. So, what's the difference between being creative? Well, there's a lot of there are a lot of elements that come into the definition of being an artist, and you go back to like theories of what is the difference between an aesthetic object and an artistic object. Well, if you go on the beach and you pick up a few pebbles and you put them on your mantelpiece, and that's very creative arrangement, and it's lovely. It's not an artwork. If you're the same person, but an artist decides to make an artwork out of it and maybe even show it in a gallery, that's this the same object will be an artwork. Do you know what I mean? It's
You know where I'm going with this, because it's a long discussion, but I think I'm actually also picking on what the woman here was saying. But you know, I remember Adrian Henri actually. Was that the Everyman, the back of the Everyman in the Oak? I thought it was.
Yeah.
I was there. I'm so old. Not
you?
quite then. I'm not quite as old as Adrian and Roger, but you know, I was around in the day.
She means Roger McGough.
I knew Roger McGough, of course, yes. No, but I did know them in the old days. But no, the real point I'm making is, you know, conceptual art and, you know, all these abstract notions of art. Underlying that, there's a real skill and talent and draftsmanship, all the things that people who, I'm sure that's what you're talking about, people who really criticise, you know, modern conceptual art, are really asking the question, where's the art? And
where's the skill is what they're asking,
exactly.
which is exactly where the definition of art separates itself from the definition of anything. I mean, beauty is not a criterion for art. Even creativity is not that much of a criterion, but there are many ways of defining an artwork. I mean, we can go back to Duchamp's urinal and say, okay, if you look at this is an artwork. If you're thinking it's an artwork because it's beautiful, you got it all wrong, then you go and congratulate the designer who designed the drawing. You don't congratulate Duchamp for choosing it. The artwork in this case is the act of the conceptual act of choosing that object and calling it an artwork. Therefore, through the institution, putting it in an art gallery, that's the artwork. It's an artwork. It's not a beautiful object. Because you could look at it and think, oh gosh, yeah, it's in a museum, so it's an artwork. I think it's quite beautiful because it looks a bit like a Brancusi. You know, there's like feminine curves in white marble, and isn't it so sexy and lovely? And you'd think it's a Brancusi sculpture. Well, you're not looking at Duchamp's artwork. You're looking at an object that is totally different. I'm not sure I'm very clear there.
I mean, I agree. Like it's not even, when you go to see Duchamp's urinal now, you're not even seeing the object, you're seeing a remake that was done in 1964. Well. So it's like, what's important, as Catherine was saying, is not necessarily the physical object, but it's the intention behind the object, and that could be the choosing of the work, or it could be the instructions that John Cage or Alan Capra gives to an audience to perform or to enact, or it could be Pollock's decision to, let the ink soak through and use the undersheet to be his drawing.
But I see what you mean also. It's a lot of people at the time, because we're talking about Pollock like he's some kind of, institution. People at the time really didn't think it was any good. Because it wasn't beautiful, because it wasn't crafted, because it wasn't art, it was just this thing that, what they used to say about Picasso, that, the donkey, the tail of the donkey, you could paint it, or anybody could do a Pollock. And I think that all those artists are interesting also because they force us to rethink what is the definition of art. Is it just a beautiful object? Is it just craft? Or is it the creation of an object that has an artistic status? Basically, there's a lot of art. A lot of it is awful. It's still art. The fact that an artwork is awful, or you can't even see the point of it, doesn't make it not an artwork. It just makes it a bad piece of art, or an interesting piece of art. And certainly in the case of the abstract expressionists, a lot of people at the time would much rather have had Thomas Hart Benton or any of the regionalists painting nice figurative, or at least recognizable figurative objects. And we didn't go into the whole CIA promotion of the abstract expressionists, but there are very many reasons why they were promoted as great artists. But even if nobody had noticed them, they still would have been artists.
Can I just bring in, there's one question there?
Yeah, exactly. It's
Hi, yes, thank you very much for that. Highly stimulating and opens up a lot of discussion, it seems, and I don't think we have enough time for that. My question is much more specific. It has a bit of, stems from references to embodiment and abstract movement. I'm a professor in dance, so I have a very particular perspective where I'm viewing Pollock's work, and I have every time I work with visual artists, when I try to engage them in movement work, I start with Pollock, and then make the painting and the brush disappear in order to bring them closer to the bodies. But I have done that intuitively without necessarily knowing the degree to which there has been any articulated links between Pollock's work and the dance world in any shape or form. I know certainly the performance art has created active links later on, but I'm not sure how much that link has been active in any way.
Do you mean like did Merce Cunningham do something based on Pollock?
Or
did Pollock work with dancers?
No,
many?
I don't think there was any direct work that took place during his lifetime, but it's a really good question because it's part of this package of his legacy and what Catherine was saying about the kind of fact that he wasn't necessarily recognised or fully understood in his lifetime. What seems to have happened is that there's kind of a time lag in the reception of his work to around the mid-60s, where a huge amount of art criticism and art history takes place that is looking at his work, so 10 to 12 years after his death, and it kind of comes to a head with a big MoMA retrospective in 1967. And I mention that just because it coincides with a lot of artists and dancers who were making work in downtown New York around the Judson Dance Theatre group that had grown out of Merce Cunningham and other dancers and choreographers. And it seems to have not necessarily been a question of influence, but more a sort of what was in the air artistically. And certainly the programs of contemporary dance that they undertook were not simply with trained dancers. So in Judson you had people who had come from Merce Cunningham and were trained ballet dancers, people like Lucinda Childs, and at the same time, within the same company, you had people like Alex Hay and Robert Rauschenberg who were painters, but they were performing in the dances alongside the elegant trained dancers, and
roller skating.
yeah, they would do the roller skating, or they would do some kind of contraption work with kind of physical apparatus on their body, but a lot of the times they would introduce painting or some kind of creation of a painting or a sculpture within those artworks or performances, and it was very much described as dance. And I think somebody like Rauschenberg is a really interesting figure, and it's maybe the link between Pollock and dance, because we know that he was very, very involved in a kind of personal reception of Pollock's work. So he had a solo show at Betty Parsons in 1951, the same year that Pollock showed these black paintings, and we actually know that he documented Pollock's show. So there's some archival images of the exhibition in our catalogue that were taken by Rauschenberg, and we had to get from his archive. And so we know that he had this kind of very close relationship to Pollock, and his own white paintings and other works like Factum were a kind of processing of Pollock. And then he turned slightly later to the Judson Dance Theatre, and he would do their lighting and stage design as well as be a participant in the dance. So this is a bit of a roundabout way of saying that perhaps it's kind of two leaps back to Pollock than a single connecting point, because he was, you know, quite a solitary figure, and he certainly wasn't kind of making costumes and sets the way that Rauschenberg and Johns were slightly later.
But interestingly, that film by Hans Nemeth, I don't know if you saw it, but it's that film where Pollock is painting, being filmed painting, and then painting on glass also. And what's interesting there is that you have music, and that the music is trying to mimic this kind of abstract music. That's almost like trying to suggest that, I mean, the word choreography is very often used in relation to Rauschenberg, and with that music, it's almost like they're trying to pair it, to suggest that that this action painting is a choreography. It isn't, but it suggests that. It suggests that in that movement there is dance.
And we also have a very contemporary link to dance now, with some of the work that is happening in
Yes.
Yeah, we heard about that. Yeah.
I know some of the dancers are here probably, are they not?
This
Don't know whether
question,
we need to-
can we get the microphone to the
There's one
back?
behind.
We'll have to make that the last question, because we've running over time a bit here.
Helen, thank you very much for a very nice conversation. This is sort of the dance, also dance.
The dance,
so going back to this, the horizontality, the way Pollock works, his process, from my dance perspective, there's kind of a hunger to want to see a Pollock on the floor. Has Pollock's work ever knowingly been...
Somebody asked me that last week as well.
Oh, really?
Actually.
Okay.
I'm really disappointed to say I have never heard of an instance where it's been exhibited on the floor, but I agree that, you know, it's really a kind of tantalizing prospect. But I've never seen any documentation of any of the past shows where something has been exhibited on the floor, but it's one of those things, like, really, I guess the closest thing we have to it is actually the floor of the studio, which has been preserved. So he certainly never exhibited a work on the floor in his lifetime, and I think that's probably why people have followed suit and not returned them to the floor. But his studio, as it's preserved in Long Island, so about 3 hours outside of Manhattan, Lee Krasner actually used it as her own studio after Pollock passed away, and it was only when she herself died in the late 80s they took up the new floor and found the preserved floor as Pollock had used it in the 50s, completely intact underneath. So that's what's visible now when you go, and obviously when you're looking at it, it's kind of like about 300 Pollock paintings on the floor simultaneously, and that to me is the sort of best record of that idea of the horizontality, which, as you say, is what is really crucial, because you are invoking, or he is invoking, gravity as a partner in his actions, and the painting isn't complete without the aid of gravity and his bodily gestures in concert with that. And this is the kind of residue of all of those actions and all of those movements within the studio. And in a way, this is kind of the problem of Pollock, in that he's been so mythologized because of that sort of the icon-making power of the studio as this kind of totemic site for creative production. You know, a lot of people have tried to dismantle that sort of mythic narrative, but I think because we focus so much on process today, I think it's important to sort of return to that, because this is simply a record of his process in one place, and the last 11 years of his practice, all of his paintings were made in this one, you know, 5 by 4 meter wooden barn, no heating, no electricity, and only the natural light from the windows allowing him to work in there. So I think that's kind of the best, or the closest we get to actually having one on the floor. And just finally, I know we're out of time, but probably for conservation reasons it will never happen, but nonetheless we have a kind of next generation riff on that in the Andy Warhol series of dance diagrams, where they were exhibited on the floor when they were first shown in '62, and when we had the Warhol show last autumn, we had one of them, the Foxtrot, I think it was, on the floor of the gallery with a very sturdy Perspex case on it, obviously. But that was Warhol's intention, that it was on the floor in a reference to that downward drag that Pollock had enacted, you know, 6 or 7 years before. So I'm sorry not to say definitely yes on that.
I'm going to have to wrap up now, and before I ask you to give your thanks to Stephanie and Catherine for their in conversation, just to say that this began as a conversation between Edge Hill University and Tate Liverpool, and it became a conversation between Catherine and Stephanie, but their discussion has enabled me to see that it's really a conversation between New York and Liverpool, which was, I think, fascinating contribution to the discussion. And then it became a conversation between Catherine and Stephanie and your good selves in the audience. So on behalf of Edge Hill University, I'd just like you to thank our 2 guests this evening, Stephanie and Catherine. Thank you.